All right. Good afternoon. My name is Randa Watts, and I am the Clean Water Organizer for Prairie Rivers Network, and I will be your moderator for today's exciting webinar. This webinar series is hosted by the University of Illinois Extension, and I'd like to thank them for all of their support. Today, we will learn from the innovative results of two recent initiatives, PV Smart and PV Success, that study the community co-benefits of solar developments. Presenters from the Great Plains Institute and the University of Minnesota will discuss new tools for planners to assess water quality risks and opportunities associated with solar energy. First, I'll go over some general guidelines. I'll introduce our guest for today and then hand the screen over to our panel. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat and we will have a Q&A at the end. We are recording this webinar, and you will get a link to the recording and contact information for the speakers in the next few days. And you can always find local government education webinars on our YouTube channel. The link can be found in the chat. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. Brian Ross is a vice president at the Great Plains Institute. He leads GPI's renewable energy market transformation efforts in the Midwest and nationally. He has participated in SolSmart from its inception, helped create the groundbreaking PV Smart and PV Success initiatives on solar and ecosystem services, and leads the community-focused Source Water Solar Initiative in Minnesota with the Minnesota Department of Health. Jake Galzki is a researcher in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota. His research utilizes GIS remote sensing technologies to help improve and promote soil and water quality management and agricultural sustainability. His recent work has focused on soil and water modeling to analyze the hydrology of ground-mounted photovoltaic systems and encourage their sustainable installation. Brian and Jake, the screen is yours.
Thank you to both Prairie Rivers and to Illinois Extension. I'm Brian Ross with the Great Plains Institute, and I'm going to share my screen. And do I need to flip it?
Yes, we're
Okay. You're seeing presenter mode. Okay. How's that look?
perfect.
Sure. All right. All right, thank you. So we're going to, Jake and I are going to run through a presentation on that we've done a number of times, but we've added a little bit of content to it, both specific to Illinois and to reflect both project findings that we've been working on, PV Success and PV Smart. It's largely kind of captured in this concept of a nature-based approach to large-scale solar for the benefit of communities. The kind of run through, we're going to move quickly because it turns out that we have a lot of slides, and I want to leave some time for questions at the end. So we will be moving quickly through this material. Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit organization. We're based out of Minneapolis. We work pretty extensively throughout the Midwest and nationally, actually, to some extent. We cover a broad range of technologies, decarbonization technologies, to meet our net zero carbon goals that we have here for the benefit of people, economy, and environment, and work across all the emission sectors. I'm the head of the Renewable Energy Program and the head of the Communities Program at the Great Plains Institute. So here is our agenda for today. We went through our welcomes. I'm going to take a couple minutes to talk about the clean energy transition and put this idea of large-scale solar at the local level in the context of larger markets. We'll talk a little bit about the co-benefits approach that we advocate for, and the PV Smart and PV Success projects and how those fit within that context. Jake will then really talk about the science of our co-benefits approach and all the field research and modeling that the University of Minnesota has done to really set the stage and create some national models particularly for water quality. I'll run over some of the best practices for water quality that we've developed from that, as well as how to incorporate at the end of this the co-benefits idea into your ordinance and permitting processes in Illinois in recognition of the citing legislation that was passed in 2023. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. I always start with my conclusions, and so in case you uh, get lost or I put you to sleep. Really, what we want you to remember is that in the energy system of the future, every community is a host community. This is different from our conventional energy system where we had a few host communities, um, and most of us were consuming communities. There's not a single community in the United States that does not have an economically viable solar energy resource, and because of that, there will be people wanting to develop it and take economic advantage of it, either at the large scale, for instance, or at the smaller scale. Most Illinois communities still have some land use jurisdiction over large-scale solar development if they choose to use it. There are some choices you have to make, and in the context of the 2023 siting legislation, there have been some limitations, but there are some ways to incorporate the kind of concepts that Jake and I are talking about today into your ordinance process or into your permitting process. Whatever you do at the county scale, and I'm talking about counties there specifically. Cities were exempt from those land use changes and statutory state changes. But third, to really think about how large-scale solar, if designed appropriately, can actually provide nature-based benefits to the host communities. And we're going to focus particularly on those nature-based local benefits, consistent with most communities' priorities, resources, and development plans, because most communities are concerned about these things and do incorporate them into their comprehensive plans or other adopted policies. So I'm going to kind of run through the energy transition fairly quickly here. This is what we've seen in the last 10 years, 15 years, has been a rapid change in both the amount of and the type of new energy generation that's being proposed. This is a national look at all of the new projects that have been proposed for connection to the transmission system in the country. This is Lawrence Berkeley National Labs does this every year. This is through the end of 2024, and you can see the a rapid ramp up from 2015 to 2024, with a peak in 2023 of new projects. Actually, there's enough projects in the queue now that it is well over almost twice, in fact, what the existing total capacity of the electric generation network in the United States is. We have that much new capacity that has been proposed, and solar projects are almost half of those projects, both solar and solar plus battery projects. There was a slight decrease we saw in 2023 due to some of the recent federal changes and that were coming about. There is some withdrawn projects, but it is still almost double the capacity that we would see. The wind and solar projects are the overwhelming choice for new generating capacity in the marketplace. It is more than, as I said earlier, all of the existing utility scale generation. And if we developed all of this solar, in the nation, it would be over 5 million acres of land that would need to be put into solar or into dual use solar in order to accommodate that. Specifically in Illinois, we've seen a very similar increase in market demand. At the end of 2023, we kind of saw the peak of solar projects being proposed with 41 gigawatts of proposed projects in the two transmission systems that are in Illinois. There was a slight decrease in that because of the erosion of federal benefits and policy at the federal level. But still, Illinois has, even today, I checked yesterday, and there are 37 gigawatts of solar in the queue. This is about as much solar as would be needed for something approaching 300,000 acres of land. All of this is going to happen, of course, at the community scale, and we need to figure out how communities are going to help address this. And the way we really talk about that is to focus on how do we see if this development is going to occur, market-driven development that communities are going to see because of their solar resources. How do we capture the co-benefits for the community to make sure that host communities are actually partners in this development process and that their priorities are being addressed. And this concept of co-benefits is one that you may be familiar with, but I'm going to touch on it here. Here is the co-benefits idea as it gets portrayed in kind of academic and scientific literature. And this is right out of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, back in 2007, talking about that most of the policies to address greenhouse gas mitigation also have other, at least equally important rationales, economic rationales, environmental rationales, social rationales, and this is kind of the academic way to address that. But the way we would like to talk about communities in terms of what the co-benefit approach is that if you actually, in a nature-based approach, are restoring watershed function, or you're enhancing habitat, or you're diversifying agriculture, or you're protecting your drinking water supplies, these are the things that communities care about. Does it really matter if doing those things also is a solar farm? And that's something to think about in terms of what the community wants and how we make sure that solar farms and large-scale solar development is actually serving the community priorities. These are the things that communities do, in fact, care about. We've done a lot of work on nature-based approaches to solar use cases, looking at things like surface water protection, drinking water protection or restoration, habitat issues in terms of restoration and protection, as well as carbon sequestration for those communities that actually have prioritized that in their own policies, and a lot of soil health issues as it relates to protecting the natural resource is the agricultural resource throughout the Midwest and certainly in the state of Illinois. So today we're going to focus mainly on water quality co-benefits, and Jake will also have some work on soil health that I think he's going to present on. That comes out of two projects, one being the PB Smart project and one being the PB Success project. PB Smart ended in 2023 and was focused exclusively on water quality and stormwater. PB Success is a broader focus on physical and cultural ecosystem services. This project was slated to go, through 2023. It was, in fact, recently canceled by the federal government in early October. However, we are continuing to roll that work into other work that we're doing at the Great Plains Institute across the Midwest. So we hope to still see a lot of benefits from it and to help communities that are interested in moving ahead and looking at this. One of the kind of primary things we're trying to do in this work in both of these projects is to create predictable and transparent permitting that benefits both the communities and the development market. And in the stormwater management world, this was really kind of measuring and modeling infiltration and runoff in solar farms in order to kind of identify what the existing conditions were in actual solar farms across the country, to evaluate and the current standards across both federal, federal, state, and local for stormwater and water quality as it's applied by different communities and governmental institutions, and to create solar-specific compliance pathways for water quality regulation that was going to meet local standards as well as enable this transparent and predictable permitting moving forward. The PV Smart project, which focused on that stormwater and water quality work, included these partners. We had 4 primary partners in that work. And the primary problem we were trying to solve was this dilemma about how to treat solar arrays and solar farms in the water quality regulatory world. A lot of jurisdictions were treating solar farms as a two-dimensional problem, treating the solar arrays as impervious surface, resulting in a lot of infrastructure that was being put in place, which was not tailored really to the unique characteristics of a solar farm, and leading to higher costs and slower solar deployment from the standpoint of people who were advocating for decarbonization or solar development, but even also leading to poorer water quality outcomes frequently because the regulatory standards were not designed for solar. Oops, I went the wrong way. So the PV Smart project really was about creating those new conditions and new models through a scientific process that Drake will describe in some detail, and then adapting that to regulatory standards. And really what we're trying to get is to the situation where the kind of conventional solar development that we had been seeing, which turns into a kind of water quality disaster that you see over here on the left, into something that is a water quality amenity on the right. So we want to move from problems to green infrastructure is kind of our goal here. And if you look carefully at this picture, you actually see that this is a picture taken in the same identical location on the same solar farm. Once was before the compliance action taken by the regulatory agency at the state level, and one was the fix that was applied to the solar farm on a forward-going basis. And this is something that a lot of companies have actually adapted these practices now as normal business practices. But there's still a need for local regulators to kind of address this and really to kind of look at the concept of trying to say, how can solar become green infrastructure? And this was really kind of the focus of the PV Success Project, at least in terms of the water quality elements, really to more broadly look at ecosystem services, including water quality on the surface level, but also other services like groundwater and soil health to enable communities to create what we call a framework for decision making and tools for better decision making and assessing risks and capturing opportunities for community benefits across both physical and cultural ecosystem services. And that included filling gaps in the scientific record that hadn't been filled yet, directly engaging potential framework users during the project, examining ecosystem priorities across different types of communities, and then recognizing also the critical role of what we call cultural services, which are things like viewshed and rural identity and economic base that come into play as well, and that also relate directly to these ecosystem services. So we're trying to create this green infrastructure, recognizing in particular that that there is a benefit to rural communities of incorporating these from the standpoint both of addressing water quality issues and some of the regulatory things that they have to address, such as impaired waters and TMDLs, as well as actually providing a means by which the agricultural community can potentially participate in some of these things and also be part of that solution. So the primary thing that came out of the PV Smart process was a what we call our solar runoff calculator, which enabled all the different parties who were doing regulatory work and development work in the solar industry, from developers and engineers to local and state regulators, and creating a common foundation of knowledge that is science-based in order to improve water quality outcomes for the host communities and create that predictable and transparent permitting process that we want to see in terms of moving solar development ahead in a way that makes sense for communities. And Jake, this is where I'm going to leave it off to you so that you can take over the presentation. I'll stop sharing, and Jake will provide us the science and field research background for which all of the regulatory stuff is based.
Thank you, Brian. I assume my screen is showing up with U of M logo.
Yeah, this looks great.
Great. Jake Galzki here, research professional in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota. And I work with Dr. David Mulla. And he's also in the Department of Water and Climate. When this project was started in 2020, these numbers are dated. Brian gave you updated figures, but I just his said it would, if developed, it would cover 5 million acres. So that's how much we've progressed in the last couple of years. But as Brian kind of introduced, these are being treated as disconnected impervious surfaces, which are the same regulatory standards that you'd hold against a parking lot. And we knew that if you have a nice pollinator habitat underneath these impermeable solar panels, it shouldn't be acting like that. So we wanted to put a lot of science behind it and sort of determine what we would actually be seeing from a stormwater perspective. So we chose 5 sites across the country. We have New York, Georgia, Minnesota, Oregon, and Colorado. And we tried to choose sites with variable soil types. So we have some fine textured heavy soils and some coarser sandier soils. We obviously have different climatic regimes throughout the country. We have some panels were tracking panels, some panels were fixed panels. Um, and yeah, and obviously different rainfall amounts for different parts of the country as well. So at all of these sites, we had set up instrumentation. In the bottom right, you see a little soil moisture probe. We had these replicated at a couple spots at each site, and we would install the probes underneath solar panels, at the drip edge of solar panels, and in between the arrays themselves. We wanted to sort of quantify the relationship of water that's moving through the soil profile. And we took some supplemental data, some infiltrometer readings, bulk density readings, and this was all to calibrate a model. So we used a model called Hydrus 3D. It models the water movement through a soil profile. Um, so it has a lot of detailed inputs regarding soil texture and bulk density and saturated hydrologic conductivity, a lot of very detailed soil parameters. And at the 5 PB test sites, we calibrated these models based on the soil and all the data that we collected. So we could compare measured data from those soil probes to modeled data from the Hydrus model. And across our 5 sites, we had basically predicted correctly to within 10% of what we were seeing at the actual measured data. So we knew that the model was doing a pretty good job at describing how water was moving through these soil profiles. We chose this model because it was able to accommodate a number of different things. The model screen cap is actually at the bottom here. It could accommodate the blue arrows, which is concentrated drip edge runoff. The red arrows indicate incident precipitation, so it's just falling between the panels. The green arrows kind of illustrate how the model can actually move water laterally and underneath the panels and infiltrate under the panels. And then finally, that purple arrow represents overland flow that the model calculates. As a result of our modeling efforts, we found that it was doing a good job at describing water flow at these sites. We simulated a couple of different scenarios, and runoff increased on average. I'm going to start with the variables that had the most impact was compaction. So runoff increased by 100% on a compacted soil versus a loose soil. So we simulated construction compaction just in between the panels, and it would increase runoff by 100%. Soil depth was another important factor. So that's the depth to a restrictive layer, shallow water table, a bedrock, a clay pan. So if we simulated a 1.5 meter soil profile versus just a 50 centimeter soil profile, that shallow profile had 80% more runoff. Our tool can simulate row crop versus mature prairie, and we would see 40% increase in runoff from the row cropping system. And then we simulated with and without arrays, all other variables remaining the same. The arrays would increase the runoff by about 14%. And then finally, panel spacing. We simulated a wide spacing panel, so there was more disconnection, more area to infiltrate between panels. And we saw that if we increase the spacing or decrease the spacing to 15 feet, made a tighter spacing, we saw 14% increase in runoff. We compared our results with the NRCS runoff curve number method. This is a very extensively studied method that has gone back into 30 or 40 years worth of data. On average, we had a 38% less runoff compared to the NRCS runoff curve number method. But their method is based off of 4 different soil hydrologic groups. So in that method, you only choose A, B, C, or D soils. And as you'll see in the next slide, we have several variables that we were going into a lot more detail on. So we realized it wasn't feasible for the general public to use this complicated modeling software. So I simulated about 1,000 different combinations that had different soil textures, different soil depths, different bulk densities, different sizes of storms. And I was able to take all of that data into a database and run some regression analysis. And I used that to convert those different combinations into a runoff curve number. So we're going to do a lot of screen caps of these little calculators. That runoff curve number of 81.4, that's the runoff curve number that the NRCS uses. It's very familiar for a lot of hydrologically related fields. And then you can take that curve number, simulate a 24-hour storm of, say, 10 inches, as you see here, and that will tell you that your expected runoff would be 7.69 inches of runoff. So I'll go into each variable here. The intended use of this calculator was to help planners, basically. If you have multiple sites that you're trying to choose from, you can do pre-construction characteristics and see what expected runoff values would be on different soil types and different soil depths, and it could help site suitable projects. But we also wanted it to help maybe some post-construction management practices, such as doing some compaction management or tillage or ripping of the topsoil to sort of decrease bulk density and increase the infiltrability of the site. So as you see here, you can convert a row cropping system, put on solar panels and establish pollinator habitat. And if you do some mitigation, some compaction mitigation, and try to reduce the bulk density of that soil by tillage or ripping, you can actually see that the expected runoff goes down from a row cropping system with a compacted soil. This is just sort of some of the data underneath the the regression that I did. You can see left is loose soils, low bulk density. Right is high compaction, high bulk density. But you can see how loamy sands, coarse soils on the bottom have lower curve numbers. They would have more infiltration and less runoff. And then it goes all the way up to clay loam. It's a heavier, finer textured soil. When it's highly compacted, it has a runoff curve number of approaching 100, meaning it would infiltrate almost nothing. So I'll run through a couple of different scenarios. If we're highlighted in red, the only variable that I'm changing, all other variables in the calculator will remain the same. So if we have a loam soil, that 10-inch rain is going to run off about 7.5 inches. If you compare that to a sandy soil site, that 10-inch rain event is only going to develop 4.2 inches of rainfall or of overland runoff. Bulk density, we noticed a lot of runoff changes with different bulk densities. I simulated sort of a loose soil on the left, 1.2 bulk density. That 10-inch rain event produces 6.5 inches of runoff. And if that soil is compacted to a heavy 1.6 bulk density, that increases all the way to 8.8 inches of expected overland runoff. This is soil depth. That represents, it's analogous to rooting zone depth. If anybody is familiar with the Web Soil Survey, it's the depth to a restrictive layer, whether that be a shallow water table, a clay pan, some sort of rocky layer. We used 3 feet on the left, and that had 6.1 inches of runoff. The shallower profile 1 foot had 8.9 inches. So the soil depth had a big effect on runoff rates as well. We didn't get to study directly the effect of vegetation because all of our sites had a perennial planting on them. But as I said before, the NRCS has studied the runoff curve number method for decades. So we just pulled numbers from the NRCS handbook, and we were able to, the tool can simulate all of these ground cover types that you see in the table here. Simulating a newly established pollinator mix on the left, we're getting that 10-inch rainfall has 7.5 inches of runoff. And if that were a turf grass underneath solar panels, that increases slightly to 8.15 inches of runoff. Slope, again, we consulted the literature on this. There's a lot of equations that can modify the curve number based on slope. 5% on the left has 7.5 inches of runoff. If that's a little steeper to 10%, that goes up to 7.8 inches of runoff. This is simply the presence or absence of panels. So all other variables remaining the same. On the left, there are no panels, 6.4 inches of runoff. On the right, panels are introduced, and there's 7.5 inches of runoff. Then panel spacing on the left is a wider 25-foot spacing, 7.5 inches of runoff. If that's narrowed down to 15 feet, the runoff goes up slightly to 7.8. And sorry, I'm kind of breezing through all this. Me and Brian have a lot of slides to cover, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So if you have anything, just drop it in the chat, and I can try to address everything when Brian's speaking. These numbers are a little dated. I think we're now into the 200s of downloads. So we're seeing downloads from several different states, but also dozens of different countries as well. So there's interest to this sort of worldwide, just because there's not a lot of science behind what the stormwater is doing at these sites. This is just a summary slide. I can pause if there are any questions right now. Otherwise, I think maybe dropping them in the chat would be good before I transition to the PV success side of things. As Brian mentioned, PV Smart ended about 2 years ago, and then we've been transitioning into the PV Success project. And my role for this project was to assess soil health at solar facilities. We have 8 sites, mostly in the Midwest here, but again, we tried to isolate a number of different soil textures so we could assess soil health at fine textured soils, medium and coarse textured soils. We collected the same data as the PV Smart project, real-time soil moisture data. So that was those measurements are being taken every 15 minutes. I forgot to mention that, but that's real-time soil moisture data. But in addition to that, we also took extensive grid sampling, composite samples. So we did 2 samples per acre at a subset of these solar farms. So basically we would get 50 composite samples at the average size solar facility, and then they were analyzed for organic matter, pH, nitrate, phosphorus, carbon, a number of different physical and chemical parameters. This is last summer's results for organic matter on our initial sites. Organic matter is sort of analogous to soil health. The higher the organic matter is in a soil, the healthier it is, the more able it is to retain nutrients, moisture, sequester carbon. And these color gradients represent a Cornell Soil Health Index. So this was developed in New York, and it just shows the distribution of all the soils that they tested in a database and where they lie for organic matter. All of our fine textured soils are in the medium high to very high categories. Chisago was one of the low categories in our medium textured soil, and then our sandier soils were in the low and medium categories. But I wanted to check this against Surgo data as well. So this is a database that's available for the whole country, and I compared the expected values of organic matter at these sites based on the soil mapping units that they have on them, and that is the red line here. So all of the data that we collected was above what the Surgo database had estimated organic matter to be. This slide moves into nitrates. So this is nitrates in the soil. Basically, when you have low nitrate in your soil, you need to add soil amendments like fertilizer and manure. But when these levels get too high, say above 20 parts per million, you're starting to have a concern of leaching. Nitrate is not bound in its stable form to soil, so it is it leaches into water, and it dissolves into water and leaches either to groundwater or surface waters. So I put the drinking water standard here. That red line is 10 parts per million. And all of our sites for the soil nitrate are well below that, except for New York, which just goes over 10 in the topsoil there. But we wanted to take this a step further this last summer, and we installed nitrate lysimeters. So these are sealed tubes that have a porous ceramic cup at the very end of them. So we installed 6 of these at 5 of our sites to a depth of 1 foot. And then every rain event, we would come sample groundwater. So this is water that was taken a foot down at our sites. So the results for that are on the right here. As you can see, all the sites are very low, except the farthest right site is called Sherco. The 4 sites to the left were about 5-year pollinator mixtures, and the site at Sherco was on its first year. So we believe this has the high values we're seeing is because it was maybe some residual amounts from the previous year's agricultural land use, or possibly some fertilizer that they added to get the pollinator mix started. But as you can see, it drops throughout the summer pretty quickly. And we do have 2 sites that you might notice actually increase throughout the summer, and that is because of sheep. We had a couple of grazing sites, which is going to be really interesting. We did another soil sampling just this last couple months. We're waiting on results for that. But we'll be able to compare before and after sheep grazing and what effect that has on soil health and groundwater quality. But even at the sites with grazing, we're talking groundwater nitrate levels under 3 parts per million, which is very low risk to drinking water. But it's interesting to note that the other sites that have no fertilizer, no grazing, nitrate in groundwater was essentially undetectable. So I think that wraps up my section. So I can pass it back to Brian. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat and I'll try to get to however many I can.
Okay, let me get set back up here. And I think I seem to need to switch it every time. So do I need to switch it?
Yep.
Okay, there we go. All right, well, in the final minutes, I'm going to talk about kind of the guidance that local governments have about how to incorporate this into their standards, regulation, and a little bit of work. We'll talk about how the kind of Illinois-specific questions that come up regarding what can local governments do in the light of the 2023 siting law changes. So we have a document that I believe has been already, we passed this along, and you guys maybe have already seen it. This is the kind of best practice. This is the best practice document that relates all the science that Jake just went over into a set of best practices that can be applied both by developers as well as by local governments or landowners who are concerned with addressing this and understanding the relationship between things that are going on the site and water quality. And it comes down to the 4 elements that Jake has already discussed: compaction, soil depth, vegetative cover, and what we call disconnection, or the space of non-covered vegetated land between the arrays. So compaction is the primary issue, as Jake noted, that between compacted soils and loose soils, we saw 100% change in the amount of runoff under most conditions. And the ways that you protect this, when you're looking at this from a local level, is to make sure you're building into your permitting process or your regulation what we call low impact development (LID) construction practices, which affect construction equipment, a staging plan, making sure there's limited amount of grading, etc. Making sure that where you're measuring compaction at post-construction, and if needed, plow, chisel, or scarify that to decompact the soils, making sure you're seeding the site between clearing of the site and construction. So getting the vegetation started is another compaction mitigation during construction method. And then post-construction, you need an O&M plan, operations and maintenance, that ensures that the target bulk density over time is being met. And there are some specific ways that this can be done. This can, in fact, be incorporated into various kinds of ordinance or permit conditions in order to make sure that you're achieving local goals around compaction. Soil depth is a little bit is something that you may not have a lot of ability to change, but it's a good thing to know about. And there are some things that do affect soil depth. Making sure you're practicing site selection and design that reflects the post-construction soil depth so that your soil depth, which is your bucket for how much water you can infiltrate, is being maximized. Making sure that's being incorporated into your stormwater and water quality modeling. It is not always incorporated into it. And looking beyond the design storm and meeting minimum standards when you do have an asset on the site where it can actually infiltrate, potentially even as green infrastructure for surrounding sites that may have some runoff. Ground cover is kind of is the third thing. Makes a fairly big difference in terms of a variety of different issues. The water quality issues really we need to recognize that infiltration and water quality is inherent in ground cover choices. That deep-rooted plants and perennial plants that retain their rooting systems over time really have an effect on infiltration abilities. It does also help decompact the soils down below the surface levels in ways that can encourage water flow. The other thing, of course, that comes with deep-rooted plants and native or naturalized ground covers is that there are co-benefits associated with that in terms of things like visual benefits on the site as well as habitat benefits. There's been a lot of work recently on both on pollinator, but also on certain kinds of game species in the Midwest and other places that show that there is a startling diversity of habitat that shows up on these sites when they're managed as a habitat-friendly site. And that has obviously local benefits, although it's not a water quality benefit. It is something that is important to many people. And then finally, the disconnection question, really a minimum distance between the panels, what we call our disconnection distance. And this is usually not a problem for most solar farms because the separation they put between arrays in order to avoid shading is usually sufficient. But if it isn't, if for instance you have shallow soils and you need to know whether or not those distances may need to increase in order to accommodate a shallower soil and a smaller bucket, if you will, on the site, that's an important thing to know up front and something that you can kind of take a look at in your stormwater modeling as you move forward. So that's the kind of conditions that can be incorporated from the science we have, the best practices into either local or state regulation, and also into development practices by developers. A lot of developers are in fact starting to use these conditions as a business model as they move ahead, because generally what they find is that if they use these kinds of techniques and they use these kinds of measurements, they will, in most cases, end up with having to do less stormwater infrastructure than they would have had to do under a business as usual regulatory standard. And so it's actually to the developer's interest in most cases to use these standards and to use these practices moving ahead. But I did want to kind of finish with just a discussion of how to incorporate co-benefits into county standards, given the 2023 conditions and laws that were passed in Illinois. Now, these don't affect, of course, city standards, only county standards. But even under these standards, Illinois communities are enabled to incorporate environmentally sensitive design into their ordinances or their permitting practices. And on the stormwater question, this is in particular because most stormwater regulation is in fact rooted ultimately in the Clean Water Act, in both state regulation and in federal regulation. The stormwater standards that local governments use, that counties use, are generally not constrained by the 2023 regulation. And we provide some We have actually this model ordinance. I guess I should have mentioned that. We have developed a model ordinance for counties, well, for counties and cities, but this section focuses mainly on counties that was post 2023 changes to the law. So we provide some examples here about both actual language that could be used depending on what your local priorities are in terms of these different issue areas. And also, each one of those, that language comes with some general guidance about what we're trying to achieve with that language in the model ordinance. And here, obviously, you want to make sure that solar farms are subject to the local community's stormwater management and erosion control provisions, as well as their NPDES permit requirements under federal law. Generally not counting solar collectors as impervious surfaces if the conditions that Jake described are met, that it complies with and maintains ground cover standards, that it maintains post-density, post-construction bulk density and soil compaction standards, that the project retains post-construction soil depth sufficient to enable infiltration, and array spacing and orientation are designed for sheet flow and to provide sufficient disconnection. These are kind of broad categories, but they do address the conditions that we described, and they are something that you can incorporate into your ordinance as even today post the 2023 regulatory standards because they are not based. They are based ultimately in state and federal standards, which are exempt from those conditions. Ground cover is another piece that you do have as a county a fair amount of discretion over. We have some language here on the left, but kind of a notation around the pollinator-friendly solar development standards that are in state law. And the 2023 standards explicitly enables counties to include a requirement for meeting that pollinator-friendly standard in any permit or ordinance that they put together, including things like that they shall submit a vegetation management plan that's consistent with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources a scorecard and with the vegetation management that Illinois DNR is assembling or has assembled. I believe they've already assembled it in order to provide guidance for sites like this. And of course, there is also the EcoCat review process, which occurs for all solar, large-scale solar developments that can stipulate additional things, or rather than stipulate, it can recommend things that the county can then adopt as a stipulation, as a requirement. That is a method that counties have to ensure environmentally sensitive design and to meet those kinds of standards. So there are several other conditions here that you can investigate to make sure that people are installing ground cover and things like uncompacted soils as if it were green infrastructure on site. And so kind of treating this infrastructure the same way that you would infrastructure on any other development site where you, for instance, want to make sure that it's established and you can actually ask for a financial guarantee to make sure that that happens if you have some doubts about the process of going forward. And then finally, there's a number of concerns about the effect of agriculture. There are things that can be done in terms of recommending what the county would like to see. The counties in Illinois cannot require certain things around agricultural protection. There are some things that must be done. For instance, the agricultural impact mitigation plan that has to be submitted, which has a lot of requirements in it to make sure that things like soil health are being addressed at least in the construction and in the decommissioning process, as well as some operation and maintenance activities. But there are other things that you can encourage. One of the things that you can do in that, for instance, if you want to explore things like agrivoltaics, we show here kind of this picture behind the text of grazing, but there are other forms of agrivoltaics as well that can be done. You can't require agrivoltaics under Illinois state law, at least not under any interpretation that I've seen so far, but you can require pollinator friendly and offer as an alternative to pollinator agrivoltaics if you would prefer to have that happen. It becomes the developer's choice in that instance or the landowner's choice. But it is something that you can encourage explicitly and create standards for that that can, in fact, result in some things that you can do to make sure that you end up with a dual use site that is going to either have a conservation solar background with things like pollinator or habitat friendly, or dual use with agricultural uses under and around and between the panels as you move forward. So there's also some work, as was mentioned earlier, around things like drinking water standards and encouraging locations of sites or providing extra incentives for places where you are locating solar farms on wellhead protection areas for rural water or supplies or municipal water supplies, which are, of course, required under state law and federal law. And again, allow you to do some things because under those standards that you might not be able to do otherwise. Um, we do look at different ways to mitigate impacts to agriculture, and I'm trying to move quickly here so we have a little bit of time for questions. Um, there are several things that can be done. In your ordinance, either by encouragement or by design, making sure that you can look at things, use of, for instance, things like interim use standards or time-limited CUP standards that allow the site to be returned to agriculture at the end of the useful life of the solar farm, protecting soil health during the construction process as well as during the operations and maintenance post-construction phase, encouraging dual land use on site, particularly in the case of agriculture, agrivoltaics, and also to look at things like encouraging agricultural conservation to mitigate loss of production on surrounding properties or even potentially in buffer areas around the site itself. So that's the end of the presentation, and hopefully we had a little bit of time for questions if people have them.
That was great, Brian and Jake. It was very fascinating. I have so many questions myself, but I'm going to open the floor up for anybody who might want to come off mute and ask their question. Looks like Sean has a question.
This is a question that Brian and I talk about, which is the problem of many farmers retiring, and they know only people who can buy their land are housing developers. So how can you have a combination of solar gardens and the small scale farmers kind of creating coalitions to buy the land, and then you could include the pollinators and all that too.
Yeah, and Sean is in Minnesota with us, and we and is referring kind of directly to, I think, some of the examples that we've been working on in Minnesota, although there are also some examples in Illinois and Wisconsin of small scale agrivoltaics, which actually also achieve benefits such as helping emerging farmers have access to land. There was a particular project that we were working on in Big Lake, Minnesota, where we figured out how to, and it was a challenge, but we managed to find a way to do this. And this is actually a case study that we can provide to you for distribution if we haven't already done that. Where emerging farmers are actually now farming between the arrays of a conventionally designed solar garden. And it is a small scale solar development. It's not a utility scale. And we probably will never get to that level of farming on a utility scale, but there are opportunities at the community scale or as a component of a large scale to actually do that farming. It does require a lot of care and development and some proactive steps because obviously, if you say to a solar farm owner, "Hey, we're going to let a bunch of farmers come in and farm between your solar arrays," most solar farm owners will say, "I'm unlocking my fence to let people come and go around my security, and what are my financiers going to say, and what are my insurance companies going to say?" Those are all things that have to be taken care of, but they can be taken care of. And so it's another model that actually adds the benefit, not just of having a dual use, but actually having an emerging farmer opportunity and local food production happening on site.
And you could have many different parcels in a bigger area. So the solar farm could be segregated from other smaller plots for the beginning farm.
Yeah, there's different models of the land use that this could be done at, but I just wanted to be able to move on to the other questions uh, as we go through here.
Yeah,
Um,
Sorry, finish up, Brian. I'll
Oh,
jump back.
no, I was starting to look at what was in the chat. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I went ahead and pulled some out here. So the next one we have is we have several communities that have been able to reject utility scale solar based on these concerns that you talked about, soil health, water pollution, and community character. Now that this research has been completed, how can local municipalities share this information to calm down concerns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And um, local communities struggle with because they don't necessarily know what the actual kind of evidence-based standards are. They hear things, and some of it's misinformation, and some of it's good information. And how do they distinguish between that? And this is one of those things that we're working actively. Great Plains Institute, but also the Illinois Extension Service and Prairie Rivers also do this work as well. We're directly working with communities to bring that information to decision makers. There will always be people who will be swayed by misinformation, but really what we want to get to is the decision makers to help them make informed decisions. Consistent with their local priorities. And for instance, we do have a lot of people who say solar panels are going to pollute water, when in fact we have, as you've just heard today, the evidence that if we do it right, we're actually creating a water quality amenity for the benefit of local governments. And we have the science for that, we have the model for that, we have the best practices for that, and we just need to be able to get it into the hands of the decision makers and people like Prairie Rivers and Illinois Extension, Great Plains Institute, various other entities that are working very successfully are trying to do that, and anything we can do to kind of help do that. We're here. Feel free to call us all. We're here to help in terms of that dissemination.
Yeah, I love that, Brian. As a reminder, we are here to help. Okay, I got one more question, and then, as I said, if anybody wants to come off mute, feel free to. But did you include floodplain management regulatory issues in your guidance?
Floodplain, well, actually, in the guidance, we did not specifically address floodplain issues. Um, and obviously, we did address uh, uh, water quality issues in regard to things like NPDES standards and TMDL standards and paired waters. To the extent that they incorporated floodplain questions, we addressed them, but we did not go in and look specifically at the floodplain federal standards or state standards as they may exist in terms of kind of incorporating those into the best practices. However, generally what we find is that the things that are in the best practices around maintaining vegetation, avoiding grading, avoiding compaction, all come into play for kind of floodplain. If you think of floodplain as a ecosystem service, those things are the same kind of characteristics would come into play for that as well. And if you also think about floodplains as a potential conservation solar dual use, you can actually incorporate that into the management of the design or into the design of the standard. What I don't know off the top of my head is how floodplain management at the local level fits into the Illinois statutory standards on land use. I don't know if that's really been tested, and I haven't looked into how that particular issue would come into play. And I think there were a couple of questions in here that were more for Jake, and maybe I don't know if he wanted to take a quick.
Yeah, I
If he's
think
still
Jake
around.
answered one. I'm not sure,
Oh,
did
did
he?
he? Okay.
Yeah, somebody had asked about subsurface drainage systems, and he had answered that question. I had wondered the same.
Okay.
Illinois has um, a lot of
Yeah,
those.
yeah. Yeah, and tile systems are obviously something that a lot of communities are very concerned about, and a lot of agricultural producers are very concerned about, and making sure that those things are incorporated when we look at all this hydrology is a important thing.
Well, does anybody else have any questions? We have about 1 minute left. Okay, I guess my last question then is Jake had said that putting solar arrays on the land increases runoff by 14%. So I was wondering, why are we not ensuring that large solar installations are incorporating ecosystem services? Like you said, if we know that it's automatically increasing runoff 14%, this seems like something that would go hand in hand.
Yeah, and that's why we're here, right? Is to help people incorporate that, because one of the things I mean, obviously that is simply two identical kind of sets of sites with and looking at the difference of just putting the panels on. And there is a little bit of variability you see in there, but there have been people who say that the solar panels don't have any impact on the site in and of themselves. And that's what we've discovered is that that's not really true. It's not a huge impact, but it's significant enough that people need to pay attention to it. And it's significant enough that it would require, in the absence of other steps, some form of stormwater management to be incorporated into development projects. Now, what most of the standards, however, are done from the standpoint of just looking at the development. What we do see, what is important to note, is that we for most conventional cropping systems, if you do a solar development that incorporates the green infrastructure concepts we've talked about in the comparison of pre-development to post-development is actually an improvement and less runoff rather than an increase in runoff. So the incorporation of solar with all these things actually can improve water quality in most cases. So that's the net effect of that.
Well, this has been amazing, and thank you so much for joining. I did want to flag for everybody who stayed on this far, our next episode is going to be on November 13th, where we are going to hear about state funding in 2026. So feel free to jump in and register for that. Thank you again, Brian and Jake. This has been fantastic.
All right, thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.